All right, now let's talk about the most common elements for working with text. So you learned about the P or paragraph element, which we use for displaying some text. So here I'm going to say, I love to teach you HTML. Now, sometimes we want to emphasize a part of our text. Let's say the HTML word here. To do that, we can wrap it inside an M or emphasis element. So here I type M, press tab. Here's the emphasis element. Let's hover over it and see what the tooltip says. It says the M element represents stress emphasis of its content. So whenever we want to emphasize some content, we can wrap it inside the M element. So in this case, I'm going to move HTML inside these tags. Now, let's save the changes. Here's what we get. So by default, browsers display emphasized content in italic. But don't assume that whenever you want to display italic content, you should use the M element. Because the purpose of the M element is to emphasize content in our HTML document. And this helps search engines extract important content in our documents. Anything to do with styling should be done in CSS. For example, here we can change the default style of emphasized elements and remove the italic. Let me show you. So in the head section, we add the style element. And here we define a rule for emphasized content. We can set the color to red and font style to normal. Now, don't worry about memorizing any of these CSS properties. We're going to go over them multiple times throughout the course. But let's see what happens now that we apply these styles. So our emphasized content is displayed in red and it's no longer italic. Now, in the past, we had an element called I, which was short for italic. If we use this element, we get the same result as before. Our content is displayed in italic. But this element is considered deprecated because HTML is not meant for styling. It should only be used for structuring content. So don't use the I element to display content as italic, okay? Now we have a similar element in HTML called strong. Let's hover over it and see what the tooltip says. The strong element represents strong importance, seriousness, or urgency of its contents. Conceptually, it's kind of similar to the emphasis element. So where you should use it really depends on your context, on your content. Now let's save the changes and see what we get. So by default, strong elements are displayed as bold. But once again, we can always change the styling. Now in the past, we had another element called B, which is short for bold. So whenever we wanted to make something bold, we use this element. But once again, this element is considered deprecated because styling should be done in CSS and not in HTML, okay? So don't use B or I elements. Now, I'm going to remove this element and just add HTML. Let me show you a cool trick. Let's say we want to wrap this word with the M element. There is a shortcut for it. So on the top, we go to the View menu. Look at the shortcut for the command palette. On Mac, it's Shift, Command, and P. And on Windows, it's probably Shift, Control, and P. So let's select HTML and then bring up the command palette. With this command palette, we can execute commands in VS Code. So here I'm going to search for a command called wrap with abbreviation. That is the first command on the list. Now we press enter, and here we type the element that we want to use to wrap our selected content. In this case, M. Press enter, done. So I didn't have to manually create an M element and then move HTML inside it. It's very handy. So this is all about text. Now let's talk about headings. So in HTML, we have 6 heading elements. H1, we have H2, H3, H4, H5, and H6. So let's see what we get. So heading 1 represents the most important heading, and heading 6 represents the least important heading. Now, one common mistake that I see amongst a lot of people is that they choose these headings based on their size. So if they want to have a heading with this size, they would just use heading 4. That is not how you're supposed to use headings, because the size can always be changed with CSS. It's a matter of styling. We should use these headings to create a hierarchy. So every web page should have one and only one H1 element. This heading represents what this page is all about. Now, nothing happens if you have multiple H1 elements. For example, I can duplicate this line and say heading 1 plus. Now look, we have two H1 elements, but this is going to confuse search engines. They're not going to figure out what this page is really all about. So every page should have a single H1 element. So I'm going to remove this line. Now, after we use H1, then we should use H2. We should not jump to H4. So let's say on this page, we're going to have two sections, one for HTML, the other for CSS. So my next heading should be H2. And here we can type HTML. Obviously, below this heading, we can have some text. So I'm going to say HTML tutorial. Our next heading should be H2. So this is the CSS section. And in this section, we can have some additional text. Let's say CSS tutorial. Now I'm going to delete these 4 headings. So let's take a look. So we have a hierarchy. On the top, we have an H1 element. Below that, we have 2 H2 elements. Now let's say in this section, we're going to have 2 subsections. There we should use H3 elements. So here's our HTML section. In this section, we're going to have 2 H3 elements. Let's say code and exercise. Now take a look. So we have a hierarchy. This is how we should use these heading elements. The better we can represent the structure of our document using HTML, the better search engines can read and understand our content. So that's all about text. Next, we're going to talk about displaying special characters in HTML.